For this session, I would like to show you how to create proper footers. If you think about web design, just about every web page on Earth has some sort of footer at the bottom of the design. And the footer is simply a section of your design that appears below your content, and it flows with your content. As your content gets taller, your footer simply gets pushed down. Now, if we start looking at our regular HTML skeleton, a lot of times it's hard to figure out where exactly do we put a footer and how do we even make it. So I want to start with my basic HTML skeleton and sort of explore those basic layouts and where that footer should go. As you can see, I've got my basic skeleton here. I've got a link to a style sheet that I'll create momentarily. But I'm going to go ahead and put some of those basic layout divs in here. Typically within a body tag, you're going to have some sort of div called container or wrapper that's going to contain everything. Inside the container, I'll generally have some sort of header, so a div ID of header. And I'm going to make these divs very small. I'm just going to say header info. And it's going to be nice and organized during my code for this part because I'm not going to have a ton of content in here. Below my header, I'm going to have a div with an ID of nav. This is going to be my navigation bar. And below my navigation, I'll have 2 or 3 columns of content. In this case, let's do 2. So I'll say C1 for column 1. And I'll make the second column with an ID of C2 for column 2. Pretty typical stuff for general design here. So as I'm focusing on my body tag, I simply see a container in the body, and that container is going to be centered and it's going to contain all of my content. Within that container, I see a header, a navigation bar, and 2 columns of content, 2 columns of stuff as I've labeled it. All of that is contained within the body tag, and it's all contained in this container. Now, where does the footer fit in? Even without thinking about CSS or the design itself, where does the footer typically go? And generally, we all know that it goes at the bottom. Well, the bottom of what? Does it go at the bottom of the container? Because I think at this point, at least in the way that I teach, I always teach that everything goes in the container. You put everything in the container, and if you center that container, then everything gets centered. Here's an exception to the rule. Generally speaking, the footer goes outside of the container. It goes after the container. So after the closing tag, the closing div tag for container, and before the closing body tag, I would have something like this. Div ID equals footer. Now, with HTML5 and CSS3 on the rise, there are, of course, other tags besides div tags where we can do this, and there actually is a footer tag that we'll explore a little bit later in another session, as there is a header and nav. But for right now, we're simply going to put a div that says footer. So assuming that this is everything in my design, everything in the body tag is what you see inside your browser window, it doesn't look like much. I've got a full layout here, minus the CSS, but I've gotten the shell of the layout of where all my content's going to go. The footer goes after the closing div. Now I want to open up a new document and go ahead and create some CSS for this. I'll go through and create the CSS for each one of these divs. A container generally has at least 3 properties. It'll have a margin of auto, which centers the container in the middle of the screen. It'll have some sort of width, and you can go 955 pixels, you can go 1000 pixels, anything really that dictates the width of your design. This is going to be that width, and I'll stick with 955. It's a pretty standard number. And generally we also have an overflow of hidden on the container. That keeps our background colors and images showing up even if the content doesn't extend that far. So it's just generally something you put on all of the wrappers or containers for your design. I'll go ahead and save this at this point. I like to save pretty early in the process, and I'm going to save this as style.css. Back in my index, I linked to a file called style.css early on. I had that built into my skeleton at the beginning of the video. So I'm going to go ahead and save that style.css now. I like the fact that it color codes my code when I save. I'm using Text Wrangler on a Mac, which color codes it for me. If you're on a PC, you can use Notepad++, and it also color codes that as well. Next, I'm going to go ahead and do the header and the nav. Both of those divs are what I would call rows. They go the width of the container. So they're going to be very similar in their properties and values. So I'll start with header. I do need a width. I can set it up at 955px, the same as the width of the container, or I could say 100%. Both of those would work just fine. I could also drop in a background color or something like that if you want, but for right now, I'm not real worried about the design. I just want to see that the content appears where it's supposed to. Although, it probably would be a good idea to put a background color on the container, just so we can see a little bit. I'll put in, let's do CCC. That'll be a really light gray. It shouldn't interfere with any of my text colors. For the header, I'm also going to put in a background color. And let's do a little darker gray this time. We'll do something like 888. That'll work. Any 3 colors is going to be a different shade of gray. The next one will be the nav bar. It'll be the same way. Pound nav. It's going to get a width of 955. It's going to have a background color also. And I'll make this background color a blue. 369 is my standard blue. So header and nav, both of these divs that we're creating, both go the entire width of the container. It's a good idea to put a height on these because this is not a part of the design that's going to expand a lot. You know, our columns below are going to contain content and they're going to need a lot of expanding room. So that is something I would leave a height off of. But for a header and a nav, I would go ahead and drop a height on there. And I'm just going to eyeball this for right now. I'm going to make this 150 pixels tall for the header. And let's make the nav, let's maybe drop in 40 pixels for the height on this. Perfect. And we can always tweak these numbers. If we look at this in a browser soon, if things aren't looking right, we can always come back and tweak these. Next, I'm going to create my column 1 and column 2, C1. And these are going to have a width. The first one I'll make 255 pixels. And they'll also have a float of left. On this first column, I'll give it a float of left because it's the column on the left. Now, when you've got columns or things that need to stack side by side, remember that they all get a float, and I'll give just about all of them a float left, with the exception of the rightmost object. So, for example, if I've got 20 columns, I would make the first 19 of them a float left and make the 20th column a float right. In this case, we're only really going to have 2 columns. So it should be pretty simple to determine which one's right and which one's left. I want these 2 widths to add up to 955, so I'll make this 700 pixels, nice round number. And I'll give this a float of right. Now, here's the section where we're trying to figure out what exactly is this footer going to look like. You know, the footer really doesn't fit into either one of these categories. You know, I said a row inside of the container is going to have generally a width and a height and maybe a background. A column inside the container is going to have a width and a float with no height. So what does a footer have? A footer is outside the container. First of all, it's going to darn near match the container. It does need to have a width. I'm going to give it 955 to make it match. it needs to have a margin of auto because it does need to be centered in the design with the container. You can put a background color on it if you choose. And I'll put in a background color of 333. It'll be a real dark gray. And really, those three properties are the same things as what we see on the container. The only thing that I don't see here is overflow of hidden, and that's because the footer is probably not going to expand and hide a lot. You can put a set height on this if you choose. Depends on your design. But there's a lot of different trends in footers right now. Sometimes they are very short, sometimes they're very tall, sometimes it's just, for footer content like copyright and trademark information or privacy policies. Sometimes they have full navigation bars. So there's not a set height. You can put that on there if you want, but I'll leave mine off for the moment. I'll save this, and I'm going to go back to my HTML file and make sure it's saved. And once we've got it saved, we should be able to drag that down and look at that in our favorite browser and come up with something like this. Now, obviously, this doesn't fit in the full window here, but you can see that there indeed is a header that is all gray. There is a navigation bar. That's why I put a few dots in there just to make sure there's some content. If you didn't put any content, any text in your divs, they won't show up. So that's why I put some text or at least some dots to make sure that there's content. But I see the header, I see my nav bar, I see column 1 and column 2, and I see this footer down here. It says footer stuff. It's kind of hard to see, black text with a dark gray background. But as I expand my browser window, it does stay centered in the middle of the screen, and it looks like as column 1 and 2 gets taller, this footer will push down because it's outside the container. So in a short summary, in the HTML, the footer goes outside the container right before the closing body tag, and the CSS for that footer is fairly simple. It simply mimics the container. It has a width, it has a margin, and a background color, and a height if you choose. So hopefully this clears up a little bit of the mystery of how to put in a simple footer.